Tonight is the second in the series of conversations to the people by the Nevis Island Administration. And what each minister will do is to give you an account of its stewardship in the past months and proposals going forward. There will be a question and answer segment at the end, and so I would want you to listen keenly and to have your questions ready when we get to that section. For starters, I would want to ask persons to put their telephones on silent or to turn them off so that we don't have any unnecessary disturbances this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll get right into the conversation, and I will want to call on, first of all, Minister Troy Liburd to start our open discussion this evening.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister Randy Williams. Pleasant good night to everyone gathered here this evening. Pleasant good night to all those of you who are following via virtual media, whether you're watching us on NTV, listening via Von Radio, or you're looking at us on YouTube or Facebook, or via any other form of social media. I want to welcome you to this, our second in this revamped series of town hall meetings dubbed Conversations with the People, an opportunity for members of the general public to come out and listen to what your government has been doing for you, the people of Nevis, and an opportunity for you to interact with your government, to ask the necessary questions, to make comments and so on. This indeed is an opportunity for government and the people to interact. We have been given a mandate to govern on behalf of the people, and we can only do that if from time to time we come and we listen to the people. I want to, at the start, thank God for his mercies. Just yesterday we were under a little storm. It's not the big hurricane or tropical storm, but nonetheless, it was a storm. I saw videos where there were flooding and so on over on our sister island of St. Kitts. And I want to thank God that nothing really bad has happened here on the island of Nevis. And we would hope that throughout the rest of the hurricane season that we can stay the same way, of course. I want to start off by speaking a bit. As you know, I'm charged with looking over the Ministry of Education, and education has been hampered in quite some ways by the onset of the COVID-19 virus. Our whole lives, all of us here on the island of Nevis, have been affected in some shape or form by COVID-19. Just recently, I think we all would know by now that just recently, one of our biggest employers on the island of Nevis, the Four Seasons Resort, they started doing some layoffs. And, you know, all of this is due to COVID. This was a year that I think you would have heard the Premier say several times that all of the projections for Four Seasons were that they were going to have one of their best years in 2020. But that has not panned out because of COVID, and it has affected every single thing. Our schools have been out. We've had no physical classes since 2 weeks before it was supposed to be the end of the second term. We weren't able to have the usual third term of school here on the island of Nevis. We were able to implement some virtual classes. First of all, we were able to use a platform in conjunction with Flow, the Flow Learn platform, where we were able to upload some of the class material relevant to the various classes, so each student could go on and look at the class material that was relevant to them and get some guidance in digesting the material. We were then able to deploy a teaching platform, and the one selected by us here in the Federation, both Ministries of Education in St. Kitts and Nevis, was the Microsoft Teams platform. We were able to deploy Microsoft Teams in all of our schools, actually. Some of them came on earlier than others, but it was not something that we here on the island of Nevis were accustomed to. So all in all, our normal way of doing things has been disrupted, and we have had to find ways to adapt. We are now at the end of July, and we are therefore in the summer months fully. This is the time when the students are accustomed to have their off time. CXC exams would have normally been over by now, both at the CSEC level and at the CAPE level, but our 5th formers and 6th formers are still doing exams. Of course, we know the storm yesterday would have resulted in some of the students who were supposed to write exams yesterday. Those exams have been put off, and we are working together with CXC now to reschedule a date for those exams to happen. So the students will get that notice shortly once CXC and the local education folks here have come up with a date. We will have those exams done shortly. So some students who were looking at their exams being completed by tomorrow, they now will have to wait maybe another week or so to have their exams completed. But we give God thanks nonetheless for the situation as it is. We are continuing our preparations for the reopening of schools. As it has been said before, we expect that schools in the Federation, and more specifically here on Nevis, we expect that schools are going to reopen come September. Both ministries are working together, and of course we have to take this school by school. So it's not a one-size-fits-all that will determine the strategy for each school, because of course we now have to be able to observe the rules as it relates to the COVID-19. We're working together with the task force. We have to observe the social distancing. There are certain spacing restrictions that have been put in, and we have to work to meet those challenges. So at the moment, both ministries are working together, going around looking at the schools, school by school, looking at the populations of the school to see exactly what sort of system we will have in place for each school. So by sometime in the middle of August, we should have all of this set for our primary schools and high schools. In the meantime, the Ministry of Education has been putting on their annual prospective teachers course. We had the first section of the prospective teachers course, and that was completed last week. And the prospective teachers course for this year, of course, had to be different from what we did in past years. In this year, we had to train the prospective teachers to not only give instruction inside a classroom setting, but they have to be trained to be able to give instruction virtually, because none of us knows where we are going to go. You know, in the not too distant future with this COVID, we don't know how long it's going to be around. We don't know if eventually when borders are open, if we here in Nevis are going to be exposed to COVID. So we have to train and prepare for those eventualities. As you would have heard this morning, as relates to our early childhood centers, our preschools, and our daycares. As the Premier would have said this morning in his press conference, that once the early learning childhood centers are able to meet the thresholds that we have put in place, they can open immediately. The government understands and the Ministry of Education understands that it is extremely important to get our early childhood centers, our daycares, and our preschools back up and running. And so we have worked together with the task force, and we have worked together with the board that deals with early learners, with the it's called the Probation and
Child Welfare Probation Board. Child Welfare and Probation.
Yes, the Probation and Child Welfare Board. And Probation and Child Welfare Board, we have put together the necessary protocols, and once the centers can meet those protocols, they can be opened. We've also had training with the center owners and with the teachers in these daycares and in the preschools, and so they have been trained to deal with the new realities in terms of COVID and so on. So we are hopeful that some of these centers will come on stream shortly, as quickly as possible, so that we can have some of our young children going back to daycare, and the parents would now be able to come back into the workforce, because quite a bit of our parents have been out of the workforce since the lockdown started and since all of the restrictions to do with COVID-19 have come into place. So once these early childhood centers are reopened, then these parents and so on will be able to come back into the workforce. And I think that will go a long way for us here on the island of Nevis. So it's a new normal for us, but we are working hard to adjust. We are working hard to ensure that our children are well served, and that we follow all of the protocols, and that our children will be safe whenever they return to school. I think it's important to stress on the health and safety of our students. We want to ensure that whenever they return to school, under whatever system we are going to have ready for September, that the safety and the well-being of our children is the most important thing. That is what we really, really have to ensure that we look out for. So going forward, you can expect a lot more communication from the Ministry of Education. You can expect to see a lot of news items as the situation goes forward. And as I said before, it is not just an effort here on Nevis, but the effort is in both islands. So we are working together to ensure that standard across the Federation is the best possible standard, is the highest possible standard. That's my quota for tonight. I would be happy to answer questions when the question and answer segment comes around. I want everybody to enjoy the rest of the night, and I think it's going to be a wonderful town hall meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Liburd. If I'm to give a little nugget from Minister Liburd, the preschool and daycares are being assessed presently and putting the necessary protocols in place for the eventual reopening, because parents need to get back to work. The teachers, the prospective teachers course, the first tranche of trainees was conducted last week, and another tranche will be done sometime later. It's expected that schools will reopen in September, and the technicians, the Ministry of Education, they are doing everything in their efforts to ensure that the schools are opened, but on a phased approach. I probably will believe that the smaller ones will go first, and then the larger ones. And lastly, the 2 platforms are in place, and so students are able to do some work at home. The Flow platform and the Microsoft Teams. That was the report from Minister Liburd. So moving right along, and we will now hear from Minister Brand, the Minister of Communications, et al.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and a very pleasant good evening to my colleagues at the head table. Very pleasant good evening also to the many persons who would have joined us here at the Franklin Brown Community Center. I also want to say good evening to our listeners via Von Radio and also to those who are viewing various online platforms.
And now, I need
It
to
is
go
indeed a
to
pleasure
Woman
for me
Building
to be
Depot
here
buy the new fridge.
to
Samantha,
update the general
stop
public
worrying.
very
You can
briefly
purchase the fridge
on a
at
few
whatever else you
matters
may
that
need with TDC
is
Woman
of
Building Depot's curbside and delivery
concern
service.
to all of
Really?
us.
Just send your request
I
via
believe
WhatsApp
that
or email.
it is well
pay online,
documented
and
that
get your purchase by
the
pickup or delivery.
Ministry of
Wow,
Communication
I'm going to try TDC curbside and delivery
have been
service
doing
now.
Terms and
human
conditions
service
apply.
as it
Check our
regards
social
to
media
our
pages for
road
all the
network
details.
development. But I want tonight to give some additional information as to a few other areas that the Public Works Department have been engaged in. And as the Minister of Education would have indicated, COVID-19 would have forced
Ladies
us
and
to go
gentlemen,
in certain different direction as it regards
pleasant good
to our
evening to
projections
everyone.
for 2020. I believe it was the Minister of Agriculture last week who indicated about the construction of some storage facility at the Prospect agriculture site to house some refrigerators. I want
Which
to
families and
advise
children
that the
were economically
Public
set
Works
adrift.
Department has been engaged in that particular construction. And we felt that it was important to partner with the Ministry of Agriculture.
And now we thank you, O God, of our people, who, despite the odds, delved deeply within themselves, and by your grace found the capacity to press on, to overcome this life-shattering disaster, to mitigate the shock to their families, to rebuild our uniquely division agriculture and commerce. We thank you for the intervention of well-meaning neighbors and church bodies who lent a helping hand. We thank you for those among us who believe that it is not too late to make reparations to the families and the survivors, knowing and convinced that it is never too late to do the right thing. So as we have come here to this honored house, in the company of these honorable men and women, we pray that in the words of one of our ancestors, a way will be found to right the wrongs surrounding the treatment of the afflicted and the suffering. Pour out your Holy Spirit upon us all, O God, both those within and those without this tent of meeting, that as Nevisions and Catechuns, we may be touched with contrition and compassion, that our indifference and our platitudes will be transformed into healing and into a tangible manifestation of genuine Christian love, spurring us to action on behalf of those who still need our care and our support. We ask these mercies, O God, in the name of Jesus Christ, who redeems and saves. Amen.
Wait a while now. Wait a while. Wait a while. Wait a while. Wait a while.
Motion for the approval of the order paper as circulated.
Good morning, all. Mr. President, I rise to move a motion for the approval of the order paper as circulated.
Mr. President, I rise to second the motion.
Question is that the order paper as circulated be approved. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Announcements by the President.
Good morning, all. Let me, at this juncture, welcome each and every one of you to this sitting of the Nevis Island Assembly. It's a special sitting in that no bills would be passed, no resolutions would be approved or passed. It is a sitting to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the greatest tragedy so far that the island of St. Kitts and Nevis would have gone through. At the same time, it gives us an opportunity to indicate our feelings in this regard. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. the Right Honorable Timothy Harris, Prime Minister, the Honorable, Your Honor, Mrs. Hailita Liebert and Mr. Liebert, Your Lordship, Your Honor, Ermine Moise, the Right Honorable Dr. His Excellency Dr. Kennedy Simmons, and all those persons who are here from the Federal House, including the Speaker, Honorable Michael Perkins, I bid you welcome. I also would like at this time to take some time out to give a background to what is to be done here today. On the 1st of December, 1869, there was a meeting of the Nevis Island Assembly, and I repeat, the Nevis Island Assembly, to establish a union with the legislature in St. Kitts. This was vehemently disapproved by the Nevis Island Assembly. In 1982, the Governor General then convened a meeting of both the legislatures in St. Kitts and Nevis with the view of merging the two parliaments together and the two islands together. Because at that time, St. Kitts was independently run and Nevis was independently run. It so happened that even though Nevis objected to the merger, the bill was passed. And so the two islands were merged together. The amalgamation of Nevis with St. Kitts was a done deal. And so, with the Bastia as the seat of government, Nevis became more dependent on St. Kitts. Over the years, there was increased movement of people and goods between the two islands. I fast forward. In 1950 and 60s, Nevisians were traveling by boat to St. Kitts for various purposes. Many found work on sugar estates, and some skilled tradesmen, and some in hardware stores, others in the establishments. Some became civil servants, some became public service workers. Many, while maintaining their families in Nevis, commute between the two islands on Saturdays because their family here in Nevis was more important than anything else. One of the most popular weekends for such travel by boat from St. Kitts to Nevis was August Monday. And whereas those Nevisians work from Monday to Saturday midday in St. Kitts, most of them would catch that boat on the Saturday afternoon to journey to Nevis. And so it was not surprising that on the 1st of August 1970, most people wanted to go to Nevis. And even Kittitians enjoyed the idea of coming to Nevis because of the activities on that weekend. No one would have thought that that would be a fatal Saturday for them. Tomorrow, August 1st, 2020, would mark 50 years since that tragedy took place, where some 233 lives were lost on the MV Christena. Among that number were hostlers, people traded between St. Kitts and Nevis with their goods, civil servants, sportsmen, young women, young men, and even Kittitians on the whole, coming to Nevis to enjoy what they thought would have been a good weekend. Christena sank. And the records would show that most, if not all, of the families in Nevis were affected by this loss. History would show that immediately after the sinking of the MV Christena, a movement was started in Nevis to reduce, to a lesser extent, the dependency on St. Kitts. And it was not surprising that when the authorities went to England to seek independence for St. Kitts and Nevis, that Nevis ensured that certain things were done in order to ensure that Nevis gained some independence from St. Kitts. Things improved over the years from 1983 to the extent that Nevis was able to formulate certain laws and ensure that the land here in Nevis was controlled by Nevisians. As President of the Nevis Island Assembly, I extend best wishes to all those who survived the Christena disaster. Finally, it is perhaps a fitting tribute to the Nevis Island Assembly that the monument in the foreground bears the names of those who perished on that fateful day. And as President of the current Nevis Island Assembly, I take this opportunity to recognize the work of all previous legislatures of Nevis and their members, those who fought to retain and maintain the Nevis Island Assembly of over 100 years, and equally, those who fought to bring back to Nevis its own legislature, of which I am privileged to observe and preside. With those few words, I now ask the clerk to read a message that I got from the Governor General in respect to our sitting here today. The clerk.
Message from the Governor General. Government House, St. Christopher and Nevis, dated July the 31st, 2020. Mr. President and members of the Nevis Island Assembly, I deem it an honor and privilege to offer this message on the occasion of this special sitting of the Nevis Island Assembly to mark the 50th anniversary of the Christena disaster. I regret being unable to be with you at this time. As a young man of 20 years of age, I well recall that afternoon in 1970 and the unfolding of this tragedy over the ensuing days, months, and years. I too was touched by the loss of classmates, friends, and acquaintances, all of us with a common link as sons and daughters of St. Kitts and Nevis. As we gather at this milestone commemoration of this maritime tragedy, we recognize the contributions of our fellow men and women to our present well-being. Let us remember them and transmit our memories to this and succeeding generations. By whatever means, we need to recognize the passing and the impact of their loss on family, friends, and all of us in one way or another. May their souls rest in peace. Sir S. W. Tapley Seaton, GCMG, CVO, QC, JP, LD, LLD, Governor General.
Thank you.
At this point, we'll have brief remarks on the occasion of this special sitting of the Nevis Island Assembly to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the MV Christena disaster. I consider it a great honor to welcome to the podium the dignitaries in the same order as set out in the program to give brief remarks. I now invite Dr. the Right Excellency and Right Honorable Sir Kennedy Simmons, KCMG, who served as Prime Minister of the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis during the period the 19th day of September 1983 to the 7th day of July 1995. Sir Kennedy.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. President, I crave your indulgence to adopt the protocol which you have established, save only to recognize, in addition to you, sir, the Prime Minister, Dr. the Honorable Timothy Harris, the Deputy Governor General for Nevis, Her Honor, Mrs. Ailita Liburd and Mr. Liburd, the Premier of Nevis, the Honorable Mark Brantley, and Mrs. Brantley, members of Cabinet, of the Federal Cabinet, of the Nevis Cabinet, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank you, Mr. President, for your gracious invitation to be a part of this historic occasion. I was immediately struck by the raison d'etre for this occasion, as expressed in your letter of invitation, and I quote, "This disaster has great historical value, as it significantly impacted the economic, social, and psychological stability of St. Christopher and Nevis." End of quote. In making my brief contribution towards the history of this event, 50 years removed, I am conscious that even in this chamber today, we may have persons who were not even born when the disaster occurred. In my autobiography titled The Making of a National Hero, I devoted a chapter to the Christena disaster, mainly in relation to my own involvement. On that fateful Saturday, it transpired that I was the only doctor on Nevis. For some considerable time prior to the day of the disaster, there was only one doctor on Nevis, in the person of Dr. Barbara Lyle, one of my classmates from UCWI. She was also known as Mrs. Cedric Harper. She was a surgeon and medical superintendent at the Alexandria Hospital and district doctor for Charlestown. Even though I was at the time persona non grata with the government of the day, perhaps it was only the minister, I was asked by the Permanent Secretary of Health, Mr. Anthony Ribeiro, if I would be willing to help by doing a weekly clinic at Gingerland. I agreed, not only because Gingerland is my ancestral home, as many of you in Nevis would know. And so usually I would fly over in the morning and fly back to St. Kitts in the afternoon. On that Saturday of the August weekend, I was required to go to Gingerland as usual. And when I arrived at the airport, I met Dr. Lyle. We spoke, and she told me that her contract was ended and she was returning to Jamaica. I inquired about her successor, to be told that she had not been told whether a successor had been appointed. I was, therefore, for that day at least, the only doctor on Nevis. Coincidentally, it being the holiday weekend, I had decided to remain in Nevis to participate in whatever action was available. I had a reservation at the Montpellier Hotel, but I was in no hurry to check in. When I did decide to go to the hotel to check in and have lunch, as I drove into the yard, the manager ran out into the yard shouting, "Don't get out! Don't get out!" They just called to say that you must come to Charlestown quick because the Christena gone down and they're bringing in survivors. So I just turned around and headed for Charlestown. I eventually set up a base of operations at the hospital and requested, in fact, the police to send word around on the western, particularly on the western side of the island, at all possible points of entry, to advise persons who were bringing in survivors to bring everybody to the hospital, because some people were going down to the pier at Charlestown. I set up a triad system, though that name was not used in those days. 65 survivors were brought to the hospital that day. I examined, documented, and treated 63 of them. When the government team of Dr. Sebastian and Dr. Kelsick arrived that night, they treated the other 2 survivors. It has to be noted that there were no lights on Newcastle Airport at that time. So a call was sent out for persons with vehicles to go to the airport onto the runway and turn on the headlamps on their cars so that the government medical team could land. Life sometimes presents us with unimaginable ironies. 10 years later, on Christmas Eve 1980, the Premier, the Honorable Simeon Daniel, now national hero, invited me to turn on the permanent runway lights on the Newcastle Airport. Now the Vance Amory International Airport. After the disaster of Christena, the tensions and the distrust between St. Kitts and Nevis was further aggravated during the tenure of its successor ferry, the Liamiga, with its intimidating presence of armed soldiers. But eventually, that too was changed. The change came when in the wee hours of February 19, 1980, two men with their support teams sat across from each other and looked into each other's eyes and believed that the respect and good faith they saw there was genuine. Together, they moved St. Kitts and Nevis away from the brink of another disaster and laid the foundation for the unity, trust, and confidence that is manifest in our people today. Now, 50 years later, the sequel to the Christena disaster cannot end with the Liamiga. Once that historic partnership was cemented, the need to provide safer travel options between Charlestown and Bastille became a high priority. It therefore fell to me to close the chapter on the horror story that the transportation between St. Kitts and Nevis had become. I did not delegate that responsibility. I went myself with a team of experts, which included the vastly experienced Division Sea Captain Earl Francis, the late Earl Francis, and the late Mr. Roy Sprove of the Virgin Islands, a highly qualified and experienced marine engineer. Together, we agreed that the Carib Queen met our requirements. We purchased the boat, and with a skeleton crew, the captain and engineer sailed the Carib Queen from New Orleans to St. Kitts, then across to Nevis, arriving on the 10th of December, 1980. That vessel served the people of our federation safely and efficiently for nigh on 40 years and made a significant contribution to the economic and social stability of St. Kitts and Nevis. However, the progress we have made 50 years after the Christena disaster should not be taken for granted, nor viewed in isolation from the historic partnership of 40 years ago. Today, the continuing evolution in the economic and social stability of St. Kitts and Nevis is being facilitated and fueled by a revolution in small business enterprise. Today, the vital lifeline of transportation of people, goods, and services across the channel is more efficient, convenient, and timely than it has ever been. Our people, our entrepreneurs, have seized the initiative and have shouldered the responsibility for this significant area of our economy and lifestyle. 5 decades after, St. Kitts and Nevis is more prosperous and progressive. Our achievements in education, health, tourism, sports, technology, and our protection and support for vulnerable groups are admirable, even in the eyes of more developed nations. More importantly, however, we have not experienced another major boating accident since 1970. To those of you who mourn loved ones lost, we stand with you. We honor their memory with prayer and reverence. We assure you in words and deeds that lessons have been learned and applied for the benefit of future generations, including your own offspring. All thanks and praise we give to God, who has strengthened us sustained us, and brought us safely to this day. May it please you, Mr. President.
I now invite our next dignitary, the Honorable Vance W. Amory, who served as Premier of Nevis during the period the 2nd June 1992 to the 11th July 2006, and also during the period 23rd January 2013 to the 16th December 2017.
Mr. President, I crave your indulgence to acknowledge the protocol established, but permit me to acknowledge the presence at this very august sitting of the Prime Minister, Dr. Timothy Harris, and the living national hero, the first Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, Dr. Kennedy Simmons, and the other serving members in leadership, but especially the Premier, whose instrumentality, I understand, was to have this special sitting. Mr. President, I want to, like the speaker before me, give due recognition to yourself for coordinating this very important sitting, and to also make reference to your note to myself in which you stated that as we are celebrating the 50th anniversary, that the disaster, that is the sinking of the Christena on the 1st of August 1970, had great historical value. I think that statement, Mr. President, is fundamental to what has happened in the last 50 years. And as you've heard from the first Prime Minister, he was part of the process to try to alleviate the suffering which sadly occurred on that fateful day. And I want to say, Mr. President, that Dr. Simmons may not remember, but I was one of his patients on that day. A young man, careless in my living, had developed ulcers and had to attend the clinic on that day. And as a little background to what I'm saying, I will say, I had left the clinic and had gone to Market Shop to come to Charlestown to get the medication which had been prescribed. And in waiting at the bridge, as we call it at Market Shop, for a bus, and the changes over these 50 years have been so stark and so developmental. For half an hour or more, there were no buses, because there were no buses. You got to live with somebody in a car or a truck or something like that. Mr. President, as it transpired, I had taught a former educator, Ines Morton, to learn to drive, taught her to drive. And she came and saw me at the bridge and stopped and asked me, "Son, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Charlestown." She said, "We'll hop in." She already had heard of the sinking of the Christena. And she, having a nephew on that boat, was clearly very distressed And so I came with her to Charlestown on that afternoon, came to the pierhead here at Charlestown, and saw something which I will never forget as long as I live. Bodies of persons being thrown up out of the rescue boats onto the pier at the time and being transported to the hospital in open pickups. Such was the nature and the tragedy of what happened 50 years ago tomorrow. And so, Mr. President, as we have come today in this special sitting to commemorate, to remember, to reflect on that tragedy, I have not come to apportion any blame, but rather to look at the reality of what that historic event, as you have called it, what it has meant to us, the people of Nevis, and I'm sure the people of St. Kitts as well, and how we have over the years sought to address the shortcomings which led to that tragedy, and which has taught us a significant number of lessons which I believe we have learned and which we clearly will not want to forget. So the sinking of the Christena on that fateful day, 1st of August 1970, affected every single household in Nevis. And I can say that, Mr. President, without contradiction. Because our people in Nevis are a very close-knit community. And whether we were blood-related or we were just members of a community, as in Rollins or Hanley's Road or Brickhill or Newcastle or Jessop's or Cotton Ground or Craddock Road, wherever those persons who had gone that morning or the day before, as we've heard, to do their trade, to sell their goods, to carry on the economic activity of Nevis, trading between St. Kitts and Nevis, in goods produced in Nevis and goods produced in St. Kitts, there was some impact on every single household in this island of Nevis. And I say that because, Mr. President, our people at that time were very close-knit. The political divide was really between St. Kitts and Nevis. And I will go no further than that, because today is not a time to speak of such matters. But all of the hucksters, all of the persons who had been civil servants working in St. Kitts, students who had gone to St. Kitts for the weekend and were traveling back and lost their lives. And you heard from the Governor General's message, classmates, friends, colleagues suffered in that fateful historic event, and it touched the lives of all of us in this country. After I had taken Teacher Inez, as I called her, to the hospital, unfortunately, her nephew was one of the survivors. We saw again and witnessed, or I saw again and helped to move bodies out of the pickups into the morgue. A gruesome but a necessary act for a young man who was there on the scene at the hospital. Again, it was not comforting to see people whom you knew, nor was it comforting to be handling the bodies of persons you did not know. But that was the impact of that tragedy on the 1st of August 1970. The week following, it's as if we were in a ghost town in this island of Nevis. and we look back at the work of the church leaders of the day, especially the pastors or the priests of the Anglican churches, Father Blunt, Father Eek, and the Catholic priests, and they had lost 2 of their nuns, which meant that it had hit very close to home to the Catholic Church. Reverend Telemark, the Methodist minister at the time. And for that week, we were in a state of absolute depression and grief and mourning until the following weekend when there was a mass funeral service at Grove Park. I make mention of those things, Mr. President, because they are essential for us to understand the impact on those of us who were part of this whole process of dealing with the impact, that historic event which changed the lives and the direction in which St. Kitts and Nevis was to go. We were an agrarian society producing crops, vegetables, tree crops, trading in that to make a living. And the prominent persons really were the women. Our women were the ones who took leadership in that activity. And the number of women who lost their lives. And I said, of all of the areas. And when we listened on Tuesday to one Ozzy Tyson, who had an interview with Webo at Vaughan Radio, and he spoke of those persons whom he knew, and because he was a survivor, or is a survivor of that tragedy. It tells you that every household, the matriarchs of those households, the ones who gave leadership because of our societal development, were lost. And Mr. President, it has taken a toll on our country. And 50 years is, in history, not a long time. Because you yourself, Mr. President, spoke of the history of the Nevis Island Assembly, 1869, when the Assembly rejected the conjoining of St. Kitts and Nevis. You spoke also of the attempt which was made forcibly to create the Gordian knot in 1882 to put St. Kitts and Nevis together, about which Sir Fred Phillips late mentioned in his book. So in terms of history, it is not a long time. But in the lives of human beings individually and communally, it is not a short time. We have many lessons which we would have learned. Travel between St. Kitts and Nevis up to that point, and Mr. President, I traveled with Christena many times, having to go to St. Kitts to grammar school. It was not a pleasant journey at the best of times. At the worst of times, we were shunted around by the captain, who seemed then to take pleasure in shifting around myself and my then sixth form colleague, the Honorable Mr. Parry, who will speak to you in a while, shifting us around because we thought we could go up to the captain's bay because we had what we thought as sixth form students privileged position. But whenever there was a listing of the boat, and you've heard this from so many persons, it was not a safe boat for crossing the seas. But that is a fact of history which, sadly, we are here today to memorialize and to remember. But we've learned from that event that we cannot take chances. We must be certain of the persons who travel between our islands on our ferries. We have seen an improvement in the ferry service. We have seen an improvement in the economic development, a change of the impact, which impact caused by the Christena disaster. We have seen an economy in services develop in Nevis, which meant that the number of persons who would travel to St. Kitts for employment is not as great as it was then. And we have certainly seen a change in the welfare and the well-being of our people. My hope, Mr. President, is that our having and your having convened this meeting to look at the Christena disaster and having made reference to the memorial which is just west of us here, a memorial which was established in 2000 to commemorate the 30th anniversary. And may I say, Mr. President, it was not intended to create any friction. It was really created to ensure that there was that visible memorial to which people can come almost as a pilgrimage, if we want to call it that, to show our respects for those persons whose lives were sacrificed for the well-being or for the good, seeking to do good for their families and for our country. And we are pleased as an administration to have established that memorial. You made mention that the names of those who were lost are listed on that memorial. We may not know if those were all the names. This came as a result of persons indicating whom they believe were on the boat. There are some whom they did not know. But we will accept, Mr. President, that the memorial is there to ensure that the people of St. Kitts and Nevis recognize that we have learned and we value, as you said, this historic event which had such a disastrous effect on the lives of the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. But we have learned, we have come some way from it, and time has a way of healing wounds. And I am praying as I speak to you and through you, Mr. President, that the wounds which were so stark and painful in 1970, that 50 years down the road, even though we cannot erase the memory, that we would have a softening of the effects. And those who have suffered, who suffered loss, especially the children, and I do remember the church taking an interest in ensuring that some of the children were taken care of. And I want to say to us today, Mr. President, that it was not, well, let me put it another way, it was a difficult time in our history. And we need to ever keep this matter in front of us, even as we seek to reconcile and to have the wounds which were opened then, have them healed, and to establish a greater and a closer relationship among our people within and between our two islands. May it please you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
I now invite our next dignitary, the Right Honorable Dr. Denzel Douglas, who served as Prime Minister of the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis during the period 7th of July 1995 to the 18th of February 2015.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. President of the Nevis Island Assembly, please permit me to adopt the protocol that has been established. But also allow me, please, to recognize the Deputy Governor General, Mrs. Liebert, Honorable Her Honor Mrs. Liebert and her husband, and also our living national hero, Sir Kennedy Alphonse Simmons, with all of the other accolades, the Prime Minister, Dr. Harris, and the three premiers, that is the sitting Premier, Honorable Mark Brantley, and former premiers, Joseph Parry and Vance Amory, and all other dignitaries who are here with us this morning. I begin by indicating that it is indeed a distinct honor and a privilege for me to address this honorable assembly on this most auspicious yet very somber occasion as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the MV Christena disaster under the theme, MV Christena, Architect of Post-Independence St. Kitts at Nevis. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that it is fitting that I repeat these words, I quote, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. His grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." End of quote. These sacred words of the famous hymn, Amazing Grace, are what really comfort me when I think about the very terrible tragedy that took place on that fateful day of the 1st of August, 1970. I believe that some 50 years ago, and I remember that beautiful day 50 years ago was a day that I too will never forget. On the Saturday morning, I actually traveled on the Christena, traveling from Nevis to St. Kitts. I was, in fact, in Nevis during my summer vacation, August vacation, staying with my brother and his friends. My brother Peter Douglas was serving police officer at that time here in Nevis. I had come up a few weeks to be with my friends here, the children of Pastor Esdale, Cammie Clark, who was a personal friend of mine, stayed at my home in St. Paul's in St. Kitts whenever he was overnighting in St. Kitts. His mother, Maud Huggins, living in Chapel Street, I believe, here in Charlestown, came down on that boat with me that Saturday morning, as my father had requested that I return home to attend what was called then the all-day service of the Wesleyan Holiness Church, called then the Pilgrim Holiness Church, on August Monday in St. Kitts. It was that same day in the afternoon that this sad event took place. I believe, Mr. President, that by the end of the day, as we've heard before from your own words, it turned what was a beautiful day into a tragedy. Because some 240, or approximately that number of persons, of the approximately 320 persons packed on the overcrowded vessel, would perish. There would only be 91 survivors, we've been told. The impact of the disaster was devastating. It is a story of tremendous loss. It is a story of pain and tragedy. It is a story of the brutality that chance and fate can unleash so unexpectedly on humanity, leaving those survivors in its wake searching for meaning and release. Today, as I traveled from the ferry pier to here, I got into a conversation with the driver of the taxi, Mr. Paris, I think his name is. And we spoke not only of those who would have been lost, but those family members, especially children, of those who remained as a result of the departure, untimely departure of their parents, their guardians, and loved ones. So the question comes to mind, have we been able to track them? Those who would have been maybe of the same age as myself then, young teenager, awaited that same summer the return of my GCE examination results. Those who were already past their secondary education life and were now maybe in colleges and universities, or those who were yet in primary schools, and those who were infants, maybe just months old, who would have been left behind as a result of the untimely departure of their parents and guardians. And so today I wonder, where are these persons today? I hope that by the grace of God, they have survived. Survived through, I believe, what would have been the terrible impact of the sudden loss and disappearance of their parents and guardians, and thus left to be at the mercy of God with the guidance of their loved ones who undertook the responsibility of caring for them. The story of the Christena disaster shares not only an anniversary, but also many similarities with the story of the journey of our people from slavery to freedom and independence that is marked by our Emancipation Day celebrations. They are both stories of untold suffering, but they are also stories of triumph. They are both monuments to our resilience as a people to beat the odds that come our way. And so today, as we keep the memory of those who lost their lives alive, we also celebrate the many heroic acts that were exhibited that day, that afternoon, that allowed the 91 to make it to shore and survive. Remember, therefore, the fishermen who had rushed to the scene and plucked very many out of what could have been a very watery grave for them. We remember those doctors, and we've heard Dr. Simmons a moment ago. We remember the nurses and the ordinary citizens who were on the scene to assist the victims as they came ashore. I want to submit here in this assembly today that there is heroism in all of us, which often rises to the surface in the face of tragedy and adversity. The heroism displayed on that day serves as a reminder that we are all our brothers and sisters' keeper. The Christena disaster was also a major transformation point in the history of our two islands, as our society demonstrated the will to innovate and change for survival. New safety rules were put in place by the administrations of the day. But as we reflect, were these the only possible things to do under those circumstances? Today, we can say that there has been truly transformation of these two islands, and we can say that truly there has been a socio-economic and political and governance revolution that has taken place in these intervening 50 years. I am pleased to say that the federal government and the Nevis Island administration of the 90s and early 200s took significant steps toward the liberalization of the transportation sector, which has led to a steady increase of operators that has made travel between the two islands much faster, easier, and much more comfortable. Today, we can say that history, to some extent, has been revisited. We have large numbers of persons still traveling between the two islands, but not necessarily for the same reason. but because there has been greater integration among the people of Nevis and the people of St. Kitts. The administration also implemented and reinforced many of the safety standards and record-keeping rules that continue to keep our citizens, residents, and visitors safe, because there continues to be that traffic between our two islands. Through the years, successive administrations have sought to regularize and deepen the relationship and the partnerships between the federal government and the Nevis Island administration, which I believe has healed many of the old wounds that once kept these two islands somewhat divided. And so when tragedy struck the Christena, it did not discriminate between the rich and poor, or between whether one was born in St. Kitts or in Nevis. We learned the powerful lesson that we are all one people, one federation under God, and we are all in this one boat called St. Kitts and Nevis together. This lesson is important now more than ever as our nation faces yet another disaster. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. Our spirit of overcoming beckons us to reach for a future that fulfills the dreams and the aspirations of those who are perished or who have perished on that day, the first day of August 1970. And so in closing, I ask that may the souls of the cherished departed continue to rest in peace eternal, and may God continue to bless our Federation, St. Kitts and Nevis. May it please you, Mr. President.
I now invite our next dignitary, the Honorable Joseph Parry, who served as Premier of Nevis during the period 11th of July 2006 to the 23rd of January 2013.
Thank you. Mr. President, I thank you for this opportunity to make brief remarks this morning in this honorable House. Permit me to accept the protocol as being acknowledged, but I dare say it is my duty to address the Deputy Governor General and Mr. Liebert, to address the Honorable Dr. Kennedy Simmons, Right Honorable Dr. Kennedy Simmons, past Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Denzel Douglas, the present Prime Minister, Dr. Timothy Harris, past Premier, the Honorable Vance Amory, and the present Premier, the Honorable Mark Brantley. Ladies and gentlemen, other honorable members. Let me first apologize for a phone that I seem not to have control over. My intention was to show a picture of the Christena sailing, which was sent to me in the early hours of this morning. I have very vivid memories of sailing on Christena. The Honorable Vance Amory referred to our days as schoolboys, when it seemed nobody wanted us to be on any boat, because it was not only the Christena, but I remember a Desmond sergeant used to knock us about when we tried to take a ride over on Friday afternoon on Monday mornings. But believe me, those were boyhood days taken in good stride, and I have very pleasant memories of them. I want to bring our minds back briefly to Nevis back in 1970. Many persons who are here who are under 50 will have no knowledge of what 1970 was like on Nevis. We were an agrarian society with very bad roads, poor electricity, an antiquated telephone system, and hardly any running water. Can you remember that? A small runway with no lights for night landing. And I would not say hundreds, but many, many hucksters traveling between St. Kitts and Nevis daily with guineps, mangoes, jellies, on a boat that had live animals. And if you were not careful, you could fall in the mess of those animals. A boat that was not really suited for human travel. Some call it a riverboat. I'm not sure what it was, but the way it behaved in the channel between St. Kitts and Nevis indicated that sometime possibly there could have been a disaster. Unfortunately, in our society in those days, you had the civil service to depend on. If you were a teacher, you could work on Nevis. If you were a civil servant, once you passed the rank of a senior officer, you had to go to St. Kitts for promotion. And so many of our people on that day were on St. Kitts and were coming home to their families for the long weekend. Earlier speakers avoided the name calling, I understood, basically because you did not want to open your wounds. But I can't help by remembering three persons who I knew were footballers and cricketers in Nevis, and who I knew very well who were coming home that day and never arrived. Sam Sweeney, the brother of Larry Richards, who was involved in acting, involved in painting, involved in football, and division of which we were proud. Orville Morton, an open bat for the island of Nevis. I think his highest score was 91. And Jim Parks, who we call Sonny Walwyn as well, who was a goalkeeper and also a wicket keeper. There are many names, friends, classmates, my classmates, Mr. Amory's classmates who never saw the end of that day. Pharaoh of Cotton Ground reminded me that on that day he lost his grandmother, a woman I knew very well. He lost his two aunts and his oldest brother. I tried to find out from him what it was like, but he was only 2.5 years old, and he really did not have a full understanding of what happened on that particular day. Families were divided forever. Families of 8 from Zion, families from Pond Hill, families from Cotton Ground, families from all over the island found themselves divided. In one instance, I understand a friend of mine said it was only a few years ago that she and her siblings were able to sleep under the same roof after so many years. I wonder if we understand the devastation of that day, the devastation that was done to families on the island of Nevis, that was done to individuals, boys and girls, men and women. Families totally destroyed. A society broken up. A society where people could not stand the pressure, the mental pressure, the psychological pressure. People who left their homes, left their jobs, and disappeared to the Virgin Islands, disappeared to Canada, to the USA, and to Puerto Rico. Can you imagine that in those days there were no psychiatrists, people not trained in psychology, so that many persons lost their minds? We speak of normality or normalcy, and none of us is truly normal. It is the point where we try to reach. Some people never were able to reach that point again. Their new normal was totally different, a denial of what happened, a denial of existence, to live in a world of their own. That is what happened to us. So it is no wonder then, Mr. President, there are people who still suffer from the trauma. There are people who still have nightmares. There are people who have frightened memories. I cannot pretend that I'm one of those. What I can say, Mr. President, that I was at university, had come home, and had worked for a month, had no money, except that I was paid on the Friday. And like many other divisions, I wanted to go to St. Kitts on Saturday to buy clothes, because we did not buy clothes on Nevis. We wanted to go and buy clothes. And the morning I felt so tired that when my grandmother said, "Walcott, are you going to St. Kitts?" I said, "No, I'm not going." I could wait until another day. Thank God, whatever laziness was in me that morning, I did not go. I did not move. Mr. Amory was trying to come to town. I, having my fiancée in Nevis, and always longing to get home to see her after being in Barbados, we were spending the afternoon in the Clark's garden. She had a car. I couldn't drive, so I depended on her. And while we were there, someone shouted, the Christena sink. It sent a chill to my bones. We traveled to town. We traveled to Boat Jones Bay, and we saw the carcasses, some which seemed to be alive still. And then in the night, I slept on the west of the house. The flares lighted my bedroom, and I had nightmare after nightmare. How could I forget that day? How could any one of us who lived and had an understanding forget that day? It was a day that was a total disaster to the people of Nevis. But I want to make a point. They say, it is said, that out of the darkest night comes a new morning, comes a new dawn, and the brightly shining sun. And I have been very proud, and I thought today that I should speak to the people of Nevis and to tell them of that renaissance, that new spring, that new birth that came out of the sinking of the Christena, that would cause me to say that all those persons, 232, 233, 240, whatever the number, because I think there were more people on that boat than we know, whatever the number that they died, a ghastly death, but they did not die in vain. In a matter of months came the Nevis Reformation Party. By the October, it was formed out of the cry of the people of Nevis, because they did not want to have another Christena. They wanted to have their own representation on the island of Nevis. Imagine in those days, if you wanted a birth certificate, that you had to go to St. Kitts for it. Maybe one of those persons who drowned only went for a birth certificate. Imagine all those little things that had to be done. And so the people of Nevis decided no more. No more. They wanted to have a government of their own. In fact, some people went so far as to ask to have a government that was directly related to the government in England. A total secession from the island of St. Kitts. I am only recounting. I am not proposing. Those were those days. And so we have to remember that out of disaster comes hope. There's always hope once there's mankind. And people who are willing to work together, to unite together for a common cause. Out of that came the NEDAX group, led by Calvin Howell, a group of young Nevisians who practiced the dance, drama, music, a band, and then in 1974 came Culturama. Culturama has its links with the disaster of the Christena. Not many people may realize that. That people had somehow to shake off that dismal feeling, that feeling of hopelessness, and to do something that was creative and positive. Today, Culturama is the #1 celebrative festival at the island of Nevis. And I hope, because we can mention it, that we are careful that Culturama continues to have its place as a cultural festival and not as a carnival. It takes more effort. It takes more time. It takes going throughout the island like Sim Daniel and others did, causing people to practice the old arts, the cakewalk, and the nurses, and the giant despair, and the masquerades. It takes time. But that is what Culturama is about. Not by jamming from Gingerland to Charlestown, or from Cottonyoung to Charlestown, but celebrating and uplifting the people of this country, lifting their psychology, their self-esteem, and their importance. And therefore, I recommend to this assembly, I recommend to the people of Nevis, remember, let us not lose that Culturama, that effort to drive Nevisians forward and to make them proud of themselves. The Nevis Cricket Association. Not many people know that the first association was called the Nevis Sports Association, which was formed under Captain Howell and lasted until about 1973. And then a group of young men, Mel Henville, Cabo Howell, Boots Griffin, Vance Amry, they formed a cricket association because cricket was dead on the island of Nevis. And I'm sure Mr. Amry will remember very well that in 1972, when I was coming home from university to mind my own business and to look for my fiancée and my girlfriend, he said to me, he said to me, Joey, help the boys when you go home. And that is how I got involved in the Nevis Cricket Association. It became a vibrant organization. It did not produce Willett, but Willett enhanced it. It did not produce Livingston Sargent, but he survived the Christena, as some of you may not know. He survived the Christena, and he led us to victory again and again. You had the three soldiers, cricket soldiers of Sargent, Willett, and Amory. And they made a difference in the 1970s that Nevis got off its derriere and became the leading cricket nation in the Leeward Islands. How many of you remember that? I was in there, couldn't play the game, but I was an administrator. I was everything, president, manager, roll off preparation of the wicket, everything. That is how we operated. Coming out of the Christena, understanding that united we stand. And that as young Nevisians, we didn't have to wait for anybody. We could do it. We did not have to wait on the politicians from St. Kitts. We could do it. You have the Nevis Credit Union, which I joined in 1972, which was formed, I think, a year earlier, 1973, which was formed in 1972, which has become a powerhouse on the island of Nevis. And then Nevisians who remained home, they decided that they were going to educate themselves. Who did not go to Barbados, to England, to the Virgin Islands? People traveled and came back with one will, like in the Bible, to rebuild a country, to rebuild an island. And I want this to remain with us, because out of that death came a new beginning, a rebirth, a movement forward. So I would say today, first of all, and I'm going to, Mr. President, I won't be much longer. I'm not sure what you're signaling to me, but you're still, oh. I want to say, first of all, those who do not know their history are doomed to relive it. Those who do not know their history are doomed to relive it. And I believe in history. I always see myself as a student of history. In other words, the Nevis Island administration came out of the disaster of the Christena. The Nevis Island administration would never have been if they were not Swanston and Stevens and Daniel and Tessie Nisbet and all those persons who gathered around the Nevis Reformation Party and brought us to the point where we have the Nevis Island administration. What did the Nevis Island administration seek to do? To prevent us from having to travel to St. Kitts on a daily basis. To prevent us from having to travel to St. Kitts with a bag of jelly. To prevent us from stealing mangoes and sour orange and stuff like that on a Thursday. To go to St. Kitts on a Friday so people could not finish school and do their exam on Friday morning. Many of you may not know that. I was fortunate. I was pampered. I was able to go to school whenever I wanted to go to school. But many of my friends at St. Thomas's School, you did not see them Friday morning because they were trying to make a living so they could buy bread and have beverage, if you know what beverage is, to drink the following week. That is how it was. And so, my people, the Nevis Island administration is an institution that must be treasured, be valued, be uplifted. The Nevis Island administration must carry out the functions that those dead people wanted to see. Remember, every time you step in parliament, every time you step in cabinet, every time you're going to address somebody on with a podium, remember those who died, teachers, students, civil servants, some of them only to buy a dress, to buy simple laundry, who went to St. Kitts and never made it back. Do not underestimate, do not abandon your government that people fought so hard for. The next thing I would want to say, the need for people to work together. I think it was the Honorable Mr. Amory who said that the only fight was the fight against St. Kitts. Divisions were united. And I think he also said he would go no further. Well, I don't plan to go any further either. But what I have to say is this. We need to educate ourselves politically. We do not have to be enemies if we do not agree. We do not have to hate each other if we do not agree. Mark Brantley, sitting over there, we get along. We're not friends, but we get along. That is how it has to be. I see poor people who have nothing, hating their brother, hating their sister, hating you for no other reason that you don't think like them politically. That nonsense has to stop, Mr. President. This island is too small. This nation is too small. If the United States of America can be crying out today and can be saying that if they had different leadership, they would not have so many people dying, or so many people would not have died. What about us in a small nation of 55,000? Or what about us in an island of 13,000, 14,000? Why is it we don't understand that what we do, we must do for the good of the country? And for those people who have gone before us, who made that ultimate and cruel sacrifice. We need to teach our children. We need to remind them. We need to get that negativity out of them. That business, again, that one against each other, the business of like crabs in a barrel, we need to get that out of it. And if one does well, others can do well too. But you don't have to pull down the man on the top to get to the top. And that is something that we must learn. United, we stand and we move forward. I want to say that in terms of the transportation, I can identify with the transportation. I must identify with the transportation. And I would say today to Dr. Simmons, who is here, I remember the days when he wanted to have the road from Bastia to the peninsula with a Roro ferry to come over to Nevis. And I remember when Simeon Daniel said to me, we're only going to get a Roro ferry out of this. We can't afford it. I said, Mr. Daniel, not only will you lose your Roro ferry, but you will not get an airport, and you will not get a seaport. Do not support that project until you get your airport and your seaport. I've let that secret out, Dr. Simmons, this morning. Today, we have the airport, we have the seaport, but we also have better communications. And we also have the Peninsula Road. I can identify with that too, because I saw the need for the movement across the waters without the use of the airport. That is something that we should treasure and we should use. The transportation, I don't care whether it's a big boat or it's a taxi boat or a small boat. Let us make use of that movement between St. Kitts and Nevis. I have always said we should be able to divorce our political ambitions from our economic and social ambitions. We are too small to stand alone. Nevis is too small to stand alone. St. Kitts and Nevis is too small to stand alone. We should learn that lesson now. And let me tell you something. If we don't learn it, COVID will teach us. And we already learned it from COVID. COVID will teach us because you need to be able to survive one disaster. And if you only depend on one thing, you're not going anywhere. So we have lessons to learn. Out of disasters, there are lessons. And I'm hoping that we, the people of Nevis, can understand the importance of transportation, the importance of economic diversity, and the importance of economic cooperation. I'm hoping the people of St. Kitts too can understand that. I always admire the first world countries. I have seen a husband and wife divorcing and still continuing to work together in business. I've seen Indians with their families building and becoming rich. I've seen Chinese spreading across the world and dominating in business and commerce. And I ask the simple question, why can't we? Why can't we? I end by saying that once again, I offer my condolences to all those who have suffered. The truth is, all of us suffered because all of us lost somebody. I am happy that we were able to survive, although we didn't have psychiatrists and psychologists. We found ways and means. I am sure people are still suffering today. People have asked me to speak of reparations. I sometimes get confused with the word reparations. But I would say that I would recommend to the governments and businesses of St. Kitts and Nevis that it will be useful to find out those who are still suffering and to see what we can do to steady them, to make them comfortable, whether it's housing. I prefer education, of course. But whatever can be done for those people who suffered 50 years ago and who are suffering or their grandchildren are still suffering. With these few words, Mr. President, if it pleases you.
I now invite our next dignitary, Dr. the Honorable Timothy S. Harris, Prime Minister of the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis, from 18th day of February 2015 to present.
Mr. President, sir, I rise with your leave, and I would wish firstly to thank you for extending the kind invitation for me to participate in this important National Assembly or Nevis Island Assembly meeting to address the matter of the Christena disaster some 50 years hence. I want to adopt the protocol so ably led before me, but it would be remiss of me were I not to recognize the members of the NIA and to thank them for agreeing to this particular event, and in particular, the premiere of the Nevis Island Assembly. I want equally to recognize our first Prime Minister, the Right Honorable and the Right Excellent Sir Kennedy Alphonse Simmons. Must recognize also the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honorable Denzel Douglas. I recognize my former colleague and former Premier of Nevis, the Honorable Vance Amory, my cousin, former Premier Joseph Parry, and I recognize equally our Speaker, the Honorable Speaker of the Federal Parliament, my classmate, Mr. Michael Perkins, the Honorable Michael Perkins, the Governor General's deputy and her husband, and all those who are especially invited to today's event, and in particular to bid welcome to the Deputy Speaker, Dr. Bernicia Nisbet of the Federal Parliament. I stood and I listened and learned a lot from the vivid recollections of those who were there at the time and lived through it. I confess that I have no direct memory of this disaster. I was born, but yet still too young to have been too far from my grandmother's yard, I guess. So I have no direct recollection of it. I am the son of a Nevisian gentleman, Godfrey Nisbet, who hails from the deep lands of Nevis and Cotton Ground. And I am the son of a Kittitian woman, Margaret Harris, from the village of Tabernacle. And so I am a true product of the federal enterprise, the federal nation-building exercise in which we are all engaged. Reflecting back, 50 years ago today, the associated state of St. Kitts and Nevis suffered what we may describe as a catastrophic ferry loss when on the afternoon of Saturday the 1st, August 1970, the MV Christena, a government-owned and operated ferry, took on water and sank as it entered the Narrows just off of Nag's Head. 50 years, of course, in the life of an individual or country, by any stretch of the imagination, is a significant time frame which can impact many generations, at least two. Therefore, I want to join with you in this memorial ceremony to observe the very traumatic event that is part of the lived history of the people of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Today we are here to remember, to pay tribute to, and honor the legacy of those who lost their lives in the Christena disaster. We also offer solace to the survivors who are still with us and to the families of those who perished way back then. Each year, this ceremony brings back vivid and detailed memories of that catastrophe, and today was no exception. I believe that those of you who were adults at that time, and we did hear it today, can recall exactly where you were when it happened and how you reacted. We heard this from Sir Kennedy, from Vance, from Parry, and from Denzel, all the speakers before me. No doubt, from time to time, you, the survivors and families of the victims, react to triggers which remind you of the pain and horror associated with this horrific event. But no matter how painful, it is an event which we must never forget. in the history of all great people and nations, there are defining moments that last throughout the ages. Some are economic, some are political, some are natural, while others are social. Then there are those seemingly singular events that touch, affect, and effect all segments of a society. The sinking of the MV Christena on August 1st, 1970, arguably was such an event for the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. True, from the recounting today, Nevis bore the brunt of the loss of lives and the hurt to the economy and people. But let it not ever be mistaken or indeed taken that this was somehow a Nevis disaster. This event must be documented and viewed as it was and still is a national disaster of St. Kitts and Nevis that engulfed the entire associated states of St. Kitts and Nevis, with its strong family ties, its friendship and work and business relationships. We are here 50 years later to recall this tragedy and to remember the 200 plus souls that perished when Christena slipped below the waves. We heard the figure recounted of 240. We have heard 232 from the reports of the commission which was released in October. We were clear that the appropriate arithmetic could not be relied upon because some of the processes which will normally attend to persons embarking on the boat were not fulfilled as dutifully as it ought to. Hence, perhaps, we can say 200 plus, and that will clear any inaccuracy with the details. We come to celebrate the strength and the resilience of some 91 survivors. And in my view, it is a testament to the transformative nature of the event and the nation, and the people of Nevis, and the people of St. Kitts. But on a day like today, when we gather to remember, we must be mindful of the fact and sensitive to the reality that this day with its ordeal is something survivors like Livingstone Sargent, Oswald Ozzie Tyson, Diane Williams Richards, and Ian Kelsick would never forget. Nor would the family of Ivan Buchanan, then Chief Public Health Inspector, forget. It was, and you heard this before me, a young Kittitian doctor named Dr. Kennedy Simmons who treated the first survivors at the Alexander Hospital. Later on that day, it would be the late Dr. Cuthbert Sebastian from the island of St. Kitts who would take over from Dr. Simmons, continuing the care and treatment of the survivors on the island of Nevis. Back then, those two men had no idea what history had in store for them. They were just doing what needed to be done for their fellow citizens. I say to all of you who are working day in and day out, putting country above self, that God will bless you. And you do not know the hour or the day, so be open to God's grace every day. Way back then, Dr. Kennedy Simmons, now so Kennedy with a long list of titles appended to his name, is now here today as our first Prime Minister and only living national hero. He became our first Prime Minister on September 19, 1983, after negotiating the St. Kitts and Nevis Constitution Order 1983, which now provides the supreme law in which the relationship between the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis and our government and people is to be constructed and fashioned. Our second Kittitian doctor, Sir Cuthbert Sebastian, 26 years after the Christena disaster, would rise to the pinnacle of national service as the second Governor-General of an independent St. Kitts and Nevis on January 1st, 1996. If national tragedy indeed tests the mettle of a people, the people of Nevis and St. Kitts demonstrated superhuman strength and resilience immediately following the disaster and in the ensuing 50 years. It is said that every family in Nevis lost someone. Vance told us that. Indeed, losing 200 plus citizens in a single event from a small population would test the fortitude of even those who were not on board. A disaster by any measure, be it by the raw numbers or on a per capita basis, it is still the worst maritime disaster in the English-speaking Caribbean. The loss of so many lives at one time was incomprehensible. The victims included people you would have heard from all walks of life. Rich and poor perished. Parents lost children. Some parents lost their only child. Others lost as many as 3 children. Children too lost parents, and some became orphans. Errol Liebert and his surviving siblings come to mind. Household lost breadwinners. Husbands and wives lost spouses. Some families lost several members. And family life, Mr. Parry told us, was shattered in many cases. The victims of this disaster included 3 Canadian nuns. Every community in both St. Kitts and Nevis was affected by this tragedy. It is a question of degrees. Everyone in St. Kitts and Nevis had a relative, a friend or acquaintance or co-worker who had either perished or survived. The trauma and pain, indeed, were overwhelming. Survivors suffered physical injuries. They endured mental and emotional problems then and for many years after. Some continue to suffer, even up to today, if we were to take the logic of Mr. Parry's presentation. Communities, indeed, would have been devastated. So consider Ossie Tyson, who lost his mother and sister, and I'm advised 2 brothers, left practically alone by his own account, was raised by the grandmother of a fellow survivor. That survivor, Livingstone Sargent, was only 10 years old at the time of the sinking. I understand that they have become lifelong friends. Only 12 years old when he went into the water, as he survived the ordeal and the trauma of loss to become a successful businessman and later an author, having documented his ordeal in a published book. It is this strength and resilience in the face of a calamity that has become characteristic of our Kittitian and Nevisian people that largely brought the islands and the nation through this difficult tragedy. Out of tragedy, what can come of it? Unfathomable then, and maybe even incomprehensible now, incomprehensible incomprehensible now is the purpose of such tragedy. And there are those of us who may even say now, 50 years after, that there was and there is no purpose for such colossal loss of life and deep human suffering. And then someone will say to us, think of Job and his own disaster. Think of Joseph, written somewhere in Genesis, and we begin to get a better appreciation what can come out of tragedy. We are mindful that we believe in an omnipotent God and an existence where nothing happens but by his will. And if it is his will, then there must be a purpose. We may never understand the why of this tragedy on this side of eternity, but we know that we can cling to the knowledge that God does not willingly grieve or afflict us. On consideration, I would want to believe and to encourage you also to believe that his purpose was to ignite in us that strength and resilience, togetherness and shared responsibility necessary for us to build an independent St. Kitts and Nevis. Even today, in the face of this COVID-19 global pandemic, to which former Premier Parry made reference, this global pandemic threatening our economic gains and social norms, we must rely even more on that strength and solidarity, resilience, and shared responsibility exhibited and embedded in us a half a century ago when Christena slipped below the waters of the Narrows. Let us therefore no longer look upon or refer to those who perish, nor those who suffer the ordeal as victims, but as heroes. Heroes whose sacrifices forge in us those characteristics that have ensured our continued success as a people and a nation. As we enjoy unprecedented cooperation between the islands, no longer is it sufficient to remember them, but indeed we must equally honor them. Very importantly, the Christena disaster highlighted serious deficiencies in ferry and other areas of maritime safety, and this came vividly from the recount of former Premier Van Seemry and others before me. Out of this tragic and painful situation came positive impacts, both for individuals and for the country as a whole. As Susan L. Taylor once wrote, in every crisis there is a message. Crises are nature's way of forcing change so that something new and something better can take its place. End of quote. While in some ways this disaster caused much bitter sorrow and exposed rifts between St. Kitts and Nevis, in many ways it also demonstrated the capacity of our people to work together, to mitigate the immediate situation and to build a better future. The fact that by 1983 we were ready to move forward as an independent nation, albeit with clauses 110 and 113, is an indication of the maturity of our leaders then and now. They knew that in spite of their insular stance, the whole of St. Kitts and Nevis was greater than its individual parts, and they embraced that big picture. They knew the truth of the parable in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 to 28. The baby, the associated state of St. Kitts and Nevis, could not be divided in two, half for Nevis and a half for St. Kitts. They opted in the end for unity, and it also emphasized how intertwined the people of St. Kitts and Nevis really are and always were. Because despite the travailing and the distancing between the political leadership, always between the people of St. Kitts and Nevis, there were strong bonds. Van spoke of his own education in St. Kitts, and there were several others. I went to sixth form with the now Speaker of the National Assembly many, many years ago. And with us, there were about 2 other Nevisians attending sixth form at the Barstow High School then. The numbers now are even larger at the CFBC College. Many vessel operators from both the island of St. Kitts and the island of Nevis immediately rose to the challenge and gave of their expertise and other resources to rescue passengers and recover the dead. Medical and other health personnel from both islands worked hand in hand to provide relief. There were many people of goodwill who reached out and provided care for orphans and gave comfort and support to the devastated families. Over time, this tragedy has helped us as a people to build character, confidence, and resilience, and develop coping mechanisms to deal with and address this horror that was beyond our individual and collective comprehension. Our faith in God, no doubt, sustained us. With strength and courage, we nurtured each other and grew stronger each day. We picked ourselves up, and carry on rebuilding lives and livelihoods. Despite the trauma and the scars, St. Kitts and Nevis look optimistically to a brighter, safer, and stronger future. It must be noted that the Christena disaster led to significant changes and improvements in maritime safety regulations and protocols. Today we are the beneficiaries of such improvements. These include regular inspection of maritime vessels, limits on the number of passengers, provision of life jackets, and certified and experienced operators and crew. Today, citizens, residents, and visitors can travel between our 2 islands confidently with the knowledge that safety measures are in place and are being adhered to, and that improvements are ongoing. The site of the Christena disaster is an underwater heritage site, as it is the final resting place for the doomed boat, as well as for some of its passengers. Perhaps it is time that we consider implementing regulations that govern access by divers to that underwater wreckage site. I recall that the St. Kitts and Nevis Observer newspaper interviewed me some 23 years ago for an article that was published on the 1st February 1997, titled Sacrilege or History, Diving the Christena Wreck. At the time, I was Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries. I said then that the area may be considered special and requires some policy. I also said that it would be important to gain some public consensus on the matter of whether diving should be allowed at the Christena wreck site. Perhaps the 50th anniversary is as propitious a time as any to put these ideas into action. Perhaps we can look at making it a protected or regulated wreck dive site where, for instance, Divers would only be allowed to view the sunken boat from the outside, and they would have to avoid contact with the remains of the boat when taking photos and video. Legislation such as a Historic Wrecks Act would be required in order to preserve and safeguard St. Kitts and Nevis's underwater cultural heritage of momentous importance to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. In closing, life, in my view and my limited experience, is never without challenges. The Christena disaster brought the noblest of the human spirit to the fore and taught us, among other things, that every challenge we face and navigate strengthens our will, our confidence, and ability to conquer future obstacles. Let us continue to work together to face our challenges as a nation with unity, with courage, resolve, and abiding faith in God. Parry had it right. Out of disaster can come some good, and several of those good things have been enumerated today. Disaster certainly, too, can bring out the worst or the best within us. In my view, 50 years after the Christena disaster, we are building a stronger and safer future together. May it please you, Mr. President, I thank you for the invitation.
Final dignitary, the Honorable Mark A. G. Brantley, Premier of Nevis from the 18th of December 2017 to present.
Who would have come before me in the persons of Dr. the Right Excellent and Right Honorable Sir Kennedy Simmons, our first Prime Minister and only living national hero, the Right Honorable, Dr. Denzil Llewellyn Douglas, former Prime Minister, now Leader of the Opposition, the Honorable Vance Winkworth Amry, former Premier and Senior Minister at the federal level, and my friend, the Honorable Joseph Parry, former Premier of the island of Nevis. Mr. President, we are gathered here today at this special sitting to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the MV Christena disaster, to share the grief felt by all, and in so doing, we hope to impart strength and courage to the bereaved, in the hope that with time, the prayers of the multitude will bring them comfort. While this special sitting might remind us of the pain felt 50 years ago, we see it as necessary to show our respect to those who perished. It is also our way of showing the surviving family and friends that we have not forgotten their departed loved ones, nor have we forgotten the enormity of the tragedy on that fateful day. To those left behind, the mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, wives, and children, the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis mourns with you on the 50th anniversary of this tragedy. We stand with you as one united family to share the burden of your grief. Mr. President, I'm fully aware that there is no script in dealing with grief. There is no rule in managing sorrow. There is no manual for mourning. However, I trust that this special sit-in will contribute in consoling all who have lost someone in the disaster, and that today, tomorrow, the day after, and in the years to come, they will find the fortitude to go on and to keep moving forward. Mr. President, each person who perished on that day had a name. Each person had a face and a story. There were those who were returning home from visiting friends and family. There were the fun lovers who were planning to enjoy the horse racing over the holiday weekend on Nevis. There were the hucksters and farmers who were returning to Nevis after a long day of selling their produce in St. Kitts. There were teachers, nurses, civil servants, persons from all regions of the career spectrum who had their contributions to nation building cut short. Let us therefore honor and remember these ones, and let their memories become an inspiration and a blessing for all. The psychological effects of the disaster have never been truly assessed. The loss of breadwinners in the family undoubtedly had a devastating impact on those left behind, especially the children. Older siblings, extended family members, and grandparents had to assume the role of parents. What we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder was common in the aftermath of the disaster. Symptoms such as flashbacks, nightmares, poor concentration, and depression were all evident in the wake of this tragedy. Indeed, the disaster had a tragic impact on our national psyche. Reflect, if you will, that in 1970, there was no psychological counseling available. Those who suffered were forced to suffer alone. Yet, Mr. President, even though our hearts are broken and our pain is deep and enduring, we have reason for hope. Our hearts are full of hope and gratitude for all those who survived that tragic day. The fullness of our heart extends to those seafaring individuals who selflessly used their watercraft to save countless lives. Their action demonstrated that heroism is found not only on the battlefield or in the movies. It does not require any special skill, training, or physical strength. Heroism is in the hearts of all of us, just waiting for the appropriate time and circumstance to be summoned and be made manifest. On that fateful day, the men and women who sacrificed so much in the service of others indeed became heroes. I pause, Mr. President, to remember Arthur Anslin, Captain Arthur Anslin of blessed memory, and Captain Winston Skeet, both of whom gave heroic service on that fateful day. Mr. President, as members of this honorable House, we can seek to honor those who have perished by taking the responsibility of ensuring that a tragedy of this nature never occurs again. Thankfully, the Air and Seaports Authority were established by Acts of Parliament in 1993 and 1995, respectively. Life jackets on any vessel must be enough to supply the passenger capacity of that vessel. Today, the number of passengers that the ferry can accommodate must be clearly marked on the vessel and not exceeded. Today, when vessels are leaving a port, they are required to inform each port of the number of passengers aboard the ferry and their destination. Today, Mr. President, each vessel must be operated by a competent and certified operator. With a determination to always take into consideration the valuable lessons learned from the Christena disaster, we will continue as a government to support the Maritime Department in enforcing these codes. As these regulations are enforced, let us continue in our prayers to God for His guidance, help, and safety as we traverse our waters on a daily basis. Mr. President, in the years following the Christena disaster, we have suffered numerous man-made and natural disasters, which could be described as national crises. Each time, we have always dug deep and overcome them with resilience and with hope. Hope for a brighter today, hope for a greater tomorrow. While we must not forget those who perished, we must also restore and rebuild the living. The time has truly come for us as a people to do more and to fix this tragedy in its proper historical context as the single most significant human tragedy in our nation's living memory. Mr. President, after consultation with my colleagues in the Nevis Island Cabinet, I wish to announce 3 new initiatives from the Nevis Island Administration in memory of the lives lost on that fateful day. 1, the Christena Memorial Scholarship, to give assistance to persons for study in the field of maritime and port operations. 2, the Christena Memorial Fund. The Nevis Island Administration, through its Youth and Sports Department, will sponsor swimming lessons each year during the summer months, and these classes will be free of cost to participants. 3, the Christena Memorial Foundation will offer assistance to persons who are doing research on the Christena disaster with a view to improving and increasing the body of literature available. Mr. President, a disaster such as this often forces us to do some introspection and reflection on the manner in which we live our lives and on our relationship with others. We take stock of our own mortality, and we are reminded of the fleeting nature of life. We recognize that what truly matters most is not money, fame, or power, but our relationship with family and friends, and the small part we have played in making the lives of others better. The brevity of life should move all of us to be our better selves. Better in our private and professional lives, better friends, better neighbors, better colleagues, better parents, and of course, better citizens. In closing, Mr. President, let me sound the clarion call for a permanent monument to this tragedy to be erected on the sister island of St. Kitts, so that this tragedy can be recognized on both islands and throughout our beloved nation with the significance and reverence that it deserves and demands. I end by once again offering my prayers for the eternal and tranquil repose of the departed souls, and my sincere and heartfelt wish to those bereaved families is that they may find peace. Thank you, Mr. President. May it please you.
Adjournment.
Let me at this time do some housekeeping matters. once the House has been adjourned, we would allow normally I would go out, but I would allow the Deputy Governor General and Mr. Liebert to leave, and then, following that, I would ask the people in the gallery, those in the gallery, with the exception of the dignitaries, to leave. On the outside, we have some refreshments. So on your exit from the building, you go to the tent where some refreshment will be served. It's a takeaway, and so you don't have to have it here if you don't feel like it. And then, 3, I am organizing a photograph of the persons, the former premiers and the premier, the prime minister and the former prime ministers, and that would be done either inside the chambers or on the steps. And for the persons in the first 2 rows, your refreshment is going to be served just as you're going down the steps. So you wait until those persons at the back exit, and then you would get your refreshment going down the steps.
Mr. President, I rise on the occasion of the adjournment, not only to move the adjournment of this Honorable House, but to take a moment to thank you, Mr. President, for presiding over what has been and is truly an historic occasion in the life and times of the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. The 50th anniversary of this tragedy has given us an opportunity for the first time in our history to hear from all of our prime ministers and all of our premiers, save, of course, for the Right Excellent Sir Simeon Daniel of blessed memory. I would want us not to downplay the significance of today. I think that today this tragedy and the commemoration of this tragedy has brought us together in a very significant way. And I want to thank you, Mr. President, for your role, and to thank my colleagues in the Cabinet, and to thank all of those in the Federal Cabinet, the Honourable Prime Minister, and all of those who have come to be a part of this today, including our former Prime Ministers, former Premiers, and many of the families and survivors of this Christena disaster. With those few words, I would wish to move the adjournment of this National Assembly and to ask that we be adjourned sine die.
Mr. President, I rise to second the motion.
Motion is that this Honourable House adjourn sine die. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. House adjourned.